Sacramento County, California, just east of the capital, sitting on the jagged banks of the American River, stands a 19th century fortress built from the very earth it occupies. From the outside, its gothic stone block architecture looks more like a medieval castle than a modern correctional facility. But this is Folsom State Prison, California's second oldest penal institution. Opened in 1880, it was constructed using inmate labor to quarry the heavy granite stones that would ultimately enclose them. Designed specifically for the most hardened, repeat offenders in the state, Folsom was built with a punishing philosophy: dark, unyielding, and inescapable. Before the advent of modern supermax facilities and remote concrete bunkers, Folsom was the end of the line. Its legendary walls have housed mobsters, revolutionaries, and some of the most predatory individuals to ever enter the California justice system. Its cramped tiers and echoing cell blocks have bred notorious violence, and its yard has swallowed men whole. 5 files sit inside this facility's history. A stuttering outcast whose early stint behind Folsom's walls did nothing to stop him from becoming Northern California's most prolific and feared serial stalker. A young predator who hunted hitchhikers along the coast before meeting a swift, violent end in the prison's own exercise yard. An auto upholsterer who hunted women alongside his own cousin, then hid in his cell out of fear once Folsom's gates closed behind him. A master escape artist who crawled through a pitch-black storm drain to freedom, earning a permanent spot on the FBI's most wanted list. And a Beverly Hills son whose shocking family annihilation traded a life of extreme privilege for decades behind 19th century Granite. This is Prison Files. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We open a new prison file 3 times a week. Case number 1. David Carpenter. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the pristine hiking trails of Northern California's state parks were transformed into hunting grounds. A predator was stalking the isolated paths of Mount Tamalpais and the Point Reyes National Seashore, ambushing hikers with a sadistic level of violence. The elusive killer, who would come to be known as the Trailside Killer, paralyzed the San Francisco Bay Area for nearly 2 years. Law enforcement was hunting a ghost, unaware that the man responsible was a seasoned product of the California penal system, a man who had already spent years absorbing the hardest lessons Folsom State Prison had to teach. His name was David Carpenter. Born in May 1930 in San Francisco, Carpenter endured a childhood marked by severe physical abuse from his father and a debilitating stutter that made him a target for relentless bullying. Deeply resentful and socially isolated, his underlying rage manifested early. By his late teens, he had already begun a pattern that would define his entire life: quiet compliance in public and violent eruptions in private. In 1960, that pattern turned deadly when he attacked a woman with a hammer and a knife during a botched kidnapping. He was sentenced to 14 years, of which he served roughly 7 before returning to the streets. The freedom did not last. In 1970, he was arrested again, this time on kidnapping charges connected to a series of assaults, and sent back into the system for another 7 years. Somewhere inside that decade of cycling in and out of custody, Carpenter did time at Folsom State Prison, where correctional psychiatrists categorized him as a severe sociopath. He was, by every clinical measure available to the state at the time, a man who should never have walked free again. Instead, he manipulated the parole board with a carefully rehearsed veneer of rehabilitation. He was paroled in May 1979. Almost immediately, the killings began. Carpenter used his intimate knowledge of the Bay Area's park systems, absorbed over years of hiking the same trails he would soon turn into crime scenes, to trap his victims in remote areas where their screams could not reach help. His first confirmed victim, Etta Kane, was shot on Mount Tamalpais in August 1979. Over the following 2 years, Carpenter murdered at least 7 more people, including Diane O'Connell, Shauna May, Ann Alderson, and Cynthia Moreland, whose fiancé Richard Stowers was also killed simply for being present. He shot most of his victims at close range with a .38 caliber revolver often prolonging the encounter to torment them before pulling the trigger. Investigators believe the true number of his victims is significantly higher, and DNA evidence has since linked him to additional unsolved killings that were never formally charged. The manhunt that closed in on him in May 1981 was almost accidental. A co-worker of Carpenter's recognized his distinctive stutter and general description from a composite sketch that had been circulating for months. When detectives pulled his record, the scope of the system's failure became impossible to ignore. A man who had spent 2 decades demonstrating, through hammer attacks, kidnappings, and rapes, that he was incapable of controlling his violence had been released not once but twice, each time convincing a parole board that Folsom and the state's other institutions had done their job. One of his intended victims very nearly changed the outcome of the entire case. In March 1981, Carpenter attacked 20-year-old Ellen Hansen and her boyfriend, Steve Hartle, on a trail near Santa Cruz. He killed Hansen, but only wounded Hartle, who survived being shot in the neck and was able to provide investigators with a detailed physical description of his attacker. 2 months later, Carpenter killed his final known victim, 20-year-old Heather Skaggs, a co-worker who had agreed to meet him about a job opportunity. Her disappearance, combined with Hartle's description, finally gave detectives the pieces they needed to connect the killings to one man. Carpenter stood trial in multiple counties, and juries in both Los Angeles and San Diego handed down death sentences. He spent more than 4 decades on death row at San Quentin State Prison, one of the oldest condemned inmates in the country, continuing to deny his guilt in interviews even as DNA evidence tied him to additional murders. When California's moratorium on executions took effect in 2019, it effectively guaranteed he would never face the gas chamber or lethal injection. He was eventually transferred to the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton as his health declined, and he died there of natural causes on September 23, 2024, at the age of 94. His story remains inseparable from Folsom, the institution that evaluated him, cataloged his sociopathy in black and white, and released him anyway, twice, into the trails where he would become one of California's most notorious killers. Case number 2. Thor Christiansen. Between 1976 and 1979, a distinct terror gripped the coastal college town of Isla Vista and the surrounding Santa Barbara area. Young women who relied on hitchhiking as a routine mode of transportation began disappearing, one after another, in a pattern so consistent that investigators eventually dubbed the case the look-alike murders, because every victim shared the same long, straight hair and similar build. The predator was methodical, cruising the coastal roads in his car, offering rides to unsuspecting women before turning a .22 caliber pistol on them. His name was Thor Christiansen. Born in Denmark in December 1957, Christiansen emigrated to California with his parents when he was 5 years old, eventually settling in the small town of Solvang, where his father ran a Danish restaurant. Despite a high IQ and a promising start as a student, Christiansen began unraveling during his junior year of high school, drifting into isolation, alcohol, and increasingly disturbing fantasies. He acted on those fantasies for the first time in November 1976, when he abducted 21-year-old Jacqueline Rook from a bus stop in Goleta. On the same day, he took Mary Ann Saris, a 19-year-old waitress. Both women were reported missing, and for weeks their families waited in agony while Christiansen moved undetected through the Isla Vista community. In January 1977, he struck again, killing 21-year-old Patricia Laney, a Santa Barbara student and juggler who had been out distributing missing person flyers for the first 2 victims when she herself vanished. Her body, along with Rook's, was discovered days later in the Santa Ynez Mountains northwest of campus, both shot once in the head and left in Refugio Canyon. The 3 deaths sparked mass demonstrations across Isla Vista, with residents demanding safer transportation options so that women would no longer be forced to rely on hitchhiking. Patricia Laney, in particular, became a lasting symbol for the community's grief. She had been an actress and a juggler at Santa Barbara, and in the years after her murder, a local festival was founded in her memory, an annual tradition that continued for decades. For more than 2 years, the case went cold. Investigators had actually questioned Christiansen once before, in February 1977, as one of several hundred people interviewed during the initial canvass of the Isla Vista community. At the time, nothing set him apart from the hundreds of other names on that list. He returned to his quiet life as a student and restaurant worker, apparently untouched by suspicion, while detectives chased leads that led nowhere. Then, in 1979, Christiansen's pattern shifted. He killed 22-year-old Laura Sue Benjamin near Los Angeles, his only victim who did not fit the physical profile of the earlier 3. Weeks later, he picked up 23-year-old Lydia Preston and shot her in the head as he had the others. This time, the bullet did not kill her. Preston survived, crawled from the vehicle, and gave police a detailed description of her attacker. Months afterward, she spotted Christiansen at a bar in Los Angeles and immediately alerted authorities, ending his 3-year run of violence. Following his arrest and conviction, Christiansen was sentenced to life in prison and transferred into the volatile, hyper-violent general population of Folsom State Prison. Psychiatrists who evaluated him before sentencing had already warned his own defense attorney that he would be in grave danger inside the system, citing both the sexual nature of his crimes and his youthful, conspicuously blonde appearance. A convicted killer of young women holds one of the most dangerous positions in any prison hierarchy, and Christiansen was no exception. He was despised almost universally by the inmate population from the moment he arrived. His path to that sentence had been its own ordeal for the families of his victims. Christiansen was initially scheduled to face separate trials in Los Angeles for the murder of Laura Benjamin and in Santa Barbara for the Isla Vista killings. Delays and procedural fights dragged the process out for the better part of a year before he ultimately withdrew a plea built around diminished capacity and stood trial on the full weight of the evidence against him. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting arguments that his psychological state at the time of the killings should reduce his culpability. On the morning of March 30th, 1981, less than a year into his sentence, the 23-year-old Christiansen was walking through the main exercise yard at Folsom. In the middle of the crowded yard, in full view of dozens of other inmates, an unidentified man approached him and drove a shank deep into his chest. Christiansen collapsed and bled to death on the granite pavement before guards could reach him. In the strict, unwritten code of the Folsom Yard, nobody saw anything. His killer was never identified, and the case remains officially unsolved to this day, a violent, localized execution carried out by the very population that judged him unfit to live among them. Case number 3, Angelo Buono Jr. In the fall of 1977, the hillsides above Los Angeles began yielding bodies. Young women, ranging in age from just 12 to 28, were found nude, posed, and strangled, discarded along roadside slopes with a chilling deliberateness that suggested a ritual rather than a crime of passion. The press, unaware they were hunting 2 men instead of 1, called the killer the Hillside Strangler. It would take investigators nearly 2 years to learn that the horror unfolding across the city was the work of a pair of cousins, one of whom, Angelo Buono, ran the operation from an unassuming auto upholstery shop in Van Nuys. Buono was born in October 1934 in Rochester, New York, and moved to California as a child. By adulthood, he had built a reputation as a skilled upholsterer and an aggressive, controlling presence around women, cycling through multiple marriages and a long list of assault and rape allegations that never resulted in serious prison time. In 1975, his younger cousin, Kenneth Bianchi, moved from Rochester to live with him in California. The 2 men quickly found common ground in their contempt for women and began pimping 2 young sex workers whom they held as virtual prisoners in Buono's home. By October 1977, prostitution had escalated into something far darker. Posing as undercover police officers to gain their victims' trust, Buono and Bianchi lured young women into their van, drove them back to Buono's house, and subjected them to prolonged sexual assault and torture before strangling them and dumping their bodies on hillsides across the Los Angeles area, often within sight of police stations, as if daring investigators to catch them. Over the following 4 months, the cousins killed at least 10 victims. The murders stopped abruptly in February 1978, not because either man had a change of heart, but because their partnership had begun to fracture. Bianchi relocated to Bellingham, Washington, where he applied for a job with the local police department. There, acting alone, he killed 2 more young women in January 1979, a mistake that led directly to his arrest. Facing the possibility of execution, Bianchi struck a deal with prosecutors and named his cousin as the second strangler, providing the testimony that would finally bring Buono into custody in October 1979. The trial that followed became the longest and most expensive criminal proceeding in American history up to that point, running for nearly 2 years and calling more than 400 witnesses. Jurors and the judge were bussed out to the actual hillside dump sites during the proceedings, walking the same slopes where the bodies had been found as prosecutors reconstructed, victim by victim, exactly how each young woman had been lured, assaulted, and killed. Buono's defense tried to paint him as an unwitting bystander to his cousin's crimes, but the physical evidence and Bianchi's testimony were overwhelming. In November 1983, a jury convicted Buono of 9 of the 10 murders. The same jury, after only an hour of deliberation, declined to recommend the death penalty, a decision the presiding judge openly criticized from the bench. In January 1984, Buono was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent first to Folsom State Prison, and once inside, the man who had spent months hunting, torturing, and murdering women effectively vanished into his own cell. Fearing retaliation from other inmates who despised sex offenders and killers of women, Buono rarely left his housing unit, choosing isolation over the general population he had once seemed to relish controlling on the outside. Even locked away and hiding from his own peers, Buono found a way to manipulate someone new. A woman named Christine Kizuka had been visiting her then-husband at Folsom, whose cell happened to be next to Buono's. After she divorced her husband in 1983, she continued visiting the prison, but her attention shifted to Buono himself. The two were married inside the Folsom visiting room in 1986. Prison officials, citing the horrific nature of his crimes and his documented history of violence against women, refused to ever allow the couple conjugal visits. Buono was later transferred out of Folsom to Calipatria State Prison in California's southeastern desert, where he spent the remainder of his sentence largely without incident. On September 21, 2002, guards found him dead in his cell, alone, killed by a heart attack at the age of 67. There was no trauma, no struggle, nothing to indicate anything but a quiet, natural death for a man who had shown none of that mercy to the women he hunted. Kenneth Bianchi remains incarcerated in Washington State to this day, still serving the sentence handed down for the cousin he ultimately sent to Folsom cells. Case number 4. Glenn Stewart Godwin. Folsom State Prison was designed to be a granite tomb, an inescapable fortress carved from the very ground it stood on. But on June 5, 1987, a convicted murderer shattered that illusion, executing one of the most audacious and legendary escapes in American penal history. His name was Glenn Stewart Godwin. Godwin was not a typical inmate. Before his conviction, he had no criminal record at all, working a string of ordinary blue-collar jobs in Palm Springs, while quietly building a reputation as a charming, ambitious young man. Those who knew him described a magnetic personality, easygoing and well-liked, the kind of person few would suspect of violence. FBI agents who studied him years later echoed that same assessment, noting that Godwin came across as friendly and unassuming in person, which made his capacity for calculated brutality all the more unsettling once it surfaced. That image collapsed in August 1980, when Godwin and his roommate, Frank Soto Jr., lured a friend and small-time drug pilot named Kim Robert LaValle to their condominium, supposedly to hand over a cash payment. Instead, while Soto restrained him, Godwin beat LaValle, attempted to strangle him, and ultimately stabbed him 26 times with a butcher knife. The two men then loaded LaValle's body into a truck, drove it into the desert, and attempted to destroy the evidence with homemade explosives. The scheme failed. LaValle's charred remains were discovered days later, and the resulting investigation led directly back to Godwin. In March 1981, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder and robbery, and he was sentenced to 26 years to life. Soto, who cooperated with prosecutors, later testified that Godwin was the most dangerous man he had ever encountered, a description that would prove prophetic once Godwin began plotting his way out of custody rather than simply serving his time. After a failed escape attempt at the Dual Vocational Institute, Godwin was transferred to the maximum security population at Folsom in early 1987. Highly intelligent and ruthlessly manipulative, he immediately began planning his way out. Authorities believe his wife, Shelley Rose Godwin, whom he had met and married while incarcerated, worked alongside his former cellmate Lorenz Karlik to smuggle a hacksaw and other tools into the prison. On the day of the escape, Godwin slipped away from the general population, cut a hole through the perimeter fence wire, and dropped into a storm drain that emptied into the nearby American River. By the time of the escape, Godwin had already made one earlier attempt while housed at Dual, a bid that failed almost immediately and led directly to his transfer into Folsom's maximum security population, a facility guards and inmates alike considered far harder to walk away from. That reputation was exactly what made his eventual success so remarkable to investigators piecing together how he pulled it off. What followed was a harrowing, claustrophobic crawl. Godwin pushed himself through 750 feet of pitch-black, narrow, heavily fortified concrete piping, navigating entirely by feel in total darkness. Waiting for him at the river's edge was a raft and a set of painted arrows on the rocks, left behind by his wife or his accomplice, guiding him downstream to freedom. By the time guards realized he was missing, Godwin had vanished into the current. And Folsom's granite walls had been defeated for the first time in decades. He fled south into Mexico, adopting the alias Michael Stewart Carrera and immersing himself in the region's drug trade. Mexican authorities arrested him in Puerto Vallarta later that same year on trafficking charges and sentenced him to a facility in Guadalajara. Back in California, the escape triggered its own fallout. Investigators eventually tracked down Lorenz Karlik in Hesperia and arrested him for aiding the breakout, while Shelley Rose Godwin went underground, evading capture for years before the FBI finally located and arrested her in Dallas in February 1990. Godwin's story, however, did not end there. In 1991, he murdered a fellow inmate believed to be a rival cartel associate during a prison riot and used the chaos of the aftermath to escape a second time. This time, he simply disappeared. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in December 1996, replacing another fugitive on the list, and despite decades of international manhunts, occasional reported sightings across Latin America, and periodic renewed interest from federal investigators, Glenn Stewart Godwin has never been recaptured. His case remains one of the longest-running fugitive investigations in the FBI's history, a near 4-decade cold trail that began the moment he vanished into a storm drain beneath Folsom's granite walls. He remains, to this day, a phantom who crawled through Folsom's darkest veins and vanished into history, the only man ever to permanently escape the granite fortress on the American River. Case number 5. Eric Menendez. In the late summer of 1989, the brutal shotgun slayings of wealthy entertainment executive Jose Menendez and his wife Kitty inside their Beverly Hills mansion captivated the nation. The subsequent arrest and highly televised trials of their sons, Lyle and Eric, became a cultural obsession that stretched across most of the 1990s. When the final verdict came down in March 1996, both brothers were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The judge ordered them separated, and Eric Menendez, a product of immense wealth, private schools, and country clubs, was placed in chains and transported to the unforgiving granite blocks of Folsom State Prison. The culture shock was absolute. Folsom was a facility dominated by entrenched prison gangs, racial politics, and a rigid, often lethal code of conduct that had nothing to do with the world Eric had grown up in. He was also a high-profile target the moment he arrived, a wealthy young man whose face had appeared on nearly every television screen in America throughout 2 consecutive murder trials. Yet inside the walls, he made a deliberate, calculated decision to withdraw almost entirely from the prison's illicit economies and gang politics, understanding correctly that visibility of any kind could get him killed. Both brothers had always maintained that the killings were committed in self-defense after years of sexual and physical abuse at the hands of their father, testimony that a first trial jury in 1994 could not agree on, resulting in a mistrial. It was only in the retrial, with a single jury and none of the earlier trial's expert testimony on the abuse allowed, that Eric and Lyle were finally convicted and sent to separate facilities to begin serving their sentences. Housed in a cell roughly the size of a walk-in closet, Eric turned his focus inward. He dedicated much of his time to religious study and became deeply involved in the prison's hospice program, working directly with terminally ill inmates during their final months, a form of service that stood in stark contrast to the crime that had put him there. In 1999, in a surreal collision of 2 entirely different worlds, he married his pen pal, Tommy Sacramento, in the Folsom State Prison waiting room. She had written to him after following his trial, and their correspondence developed into a relationship conducted almost entirely through letters and supervised visits. A Twinkie served as their wedding cake, a jarring, almost absurd contrast to the millions of dollars Eric had stood to inherit before the murders reduced his entire life to a cell block and a mailing address. Eric spent years navigating one of the most historically violent prisons in the country by making himself, as much as possible, invisible to its predators. His time at Folsom is often described as a study in extreme adaptation, a man stripped of every form of societal privilege he had once taken for granted, forced to survive using humility and near total withdrawal rather than any of the advantages that had defined his earlier life. He was eventually transferred out of Folsom to Pleasant Valley State Prison in Central California, continuing a sentence that showed no signs of ending. Then, in April 2018, more than 2 decades after the brothers were separated following their conviction, Eric was transferred into the same housing unit as Lyle at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility near San Diego. Corrections officials confirmed the brothers embraced for several minutes without speaking when the door opened between them, the first time they had been together since their sentencing. Both men remain incarcerated at Donovan, where they now share meals and yard time, having spent the intervening decades on almost entirely separate paths through the California prison system. The case that began at Folsom did not stay frozen in the 1990s. Renewed public interest, fueled by documentaries and a dramatized television series, helped push a resentencing effort through the Los Angeles courts, and in 2025, a judge reduced both brothers' sentences from life without parole to 50 years to life, making them eligible for parole for the first time in their adult lives. Eric's first hearing came on August 21, 2025, a marathon session lasting nearly 10 hours in which he discussed his history of drug use, the burglaries that preceded the murders, and the killing of his mother in unflinching detail. The parole board ultimately denied his release, citing his continued willingness to break rules even decades into his sentence, and ruling that he remained an unreasonable risk to public safety. He is eligible to be considered again in 3 years. But it was Eric's formative years, the ones that shaped how he would survive the rest of his sentence, long before any resentencing was ever on the table, that were defined by the heavy, echoing tears of Folsom, the place where the Beverly Hills illusion permanently shattered and a very different kind of survival began. Every case in this file is anchored to the heavy granite quarried from the banks of the American River. What remains is the legacy of what those walls contained and what they ultimately could not hold. David Carpenter used his time inside to refine a rage that would eventually terrorize the hiking trails of Northern California for 2 years before it finally caught up with him decades later, in a hospital bed instead of a gas chamber. Thor Christiansen found out that the predators on the outside are often prey on the inside, bleeding out on the yard's concrete less than a year into his sentence. Angelo Buono hunted women for months as one half of a killing partnership, then spent his remaining decades hiding from his own reflection in a cell, still finding a way to manipulate one more person into loving him from behind bars. Glenn Stewart Godwin proved that even a granite fortress has a blind spot, crawling through the dark to a freedom he has never relinquished. And Eric Menendez traded a life of unimaginable wealth for decades of quiet, calculated survival, adapting to an underworld he was never built for, and somehow enduring it anyway. The Gothic architecture still looms over Represa, California. The river still rushes past the perimeter. While the modern penal system has shifted toward remote, sterile concrete supermaxes, Folsom remains, a 19th century trap of steel and stone, a monument to hard time in its most classical, brutal form. That's Prison Files. Tell us in the comments which case or which facility you want open next.